Great, let's jump straight into this explainer and tackle a deeply uncomfortable but absolutely fascinating idea. We're looking at the concept that every single modern political ideology actually inadvertently strengthens the exact financial architecture it's trying to fight. Now, I know that sounds like a massive claim, but as we unpack the source material today, you'll see this isn't about having the wrong opinions. It's about how the very frameworks we use to organize our world might literally be feeding the systems we are so desperately trying to fix. Because this material challenges some deeply held beliefs across the entire political spectrum, we are going to systematically track how energy flows through our political systems using this roadmap: the ideological inversion, the invisible substrate, the engagement asymmetry, the closed loop, and finally, the structural precondition. Section 1. The ideological inversion. Think of our political camps as doctors. They correctly identify a symptom of a disease, but then they prescribe a cure that accidentally feeds the underlying pathogen. Take the left, for example. They correctly identify that the public is being looted, so they want more public spending. Or the right, who correctly diagnose that the state is captured, so they push for deregulation. But here's the catch. When you run these prescriptions through our existing fractional reserve banking system, a system that inherently creates new money via debt, it just enlarges the corporate-state nexus that both sides oppose. The left's spending gets funneled right through financial institutions, infleeing assets way before it ever reaches workers. And the right's deregulation, it frees up capital that just accelerates corporate consolidation because of access to cheap credit. They both nail the diagnosis, but their solutions, when fed into the specific monetary machine, literally just intensify the system. And we see a similar biophysical trap for the Green Camp in Nate Higgins' source data. Since 1990, we've achieved a 36% gain in energy efficiency. That's a huge technological win, right? But wait, it was accompanied by a 63% increase in total consumption. The credit-fueled fractional reserve system essentially pulls resource consumption forward in time way faster than our technology improves, which completely overrides the intended impact of any climate policy. Higgins sums this up perfectly when he says, trying to mitigate climate change within existing economic structures is like arguing with a forest fire. The monetary system is a continuous accelerator. And let's be real, a forest fire is completely uninterested in your reasoning or your political affiliation, just as long as you keep throwing fuel on it. Section 2. The invisible substrate. So this brings up a huge question. If these mechanisms are so heavily documented, things like the Cantillon effect, where newly printed money only benefits those closest to the printer, or fiat debasement, the continuous devaluation of currency, why do incredibly well-meaning people keep missing the target? The components of this machine aren't exactly a secret. People have been writing about them for centuries. Why don't the scattered puzzle pieces of our economic reality actually assemble into a single cohesive picture in the public mind? Well, we essentially ignore this substrate for 3 really powerful reasons. First, it's about identity. Fractional reserve banking doesn't exactly offer the comforting tribal identity of a neat political label. Second, institutional training. Academia literally does not credential economists to question the system itself. They're strictly trained to manage it. And third, psychology. Realizing that your team, despite all its best intentions, is actually feeding the disease, that is a deeply, deeply uncomfortable truth for anyone to sit with. Let's look at a concrete example of this from the source material. Grace Blakely is a brilliant analyst on the political left. She perfectly maps out the symbiosis of corporate power and the captured state. She completely documents the endless pool of circulating money and asset inflation with razor-sharp precision. But because her ideological framework lacks that underlying monetary category, she describes every single downstream consequence of the Cantillon effect without ever identifying the actual cause. And because of that structural blind spot, her prescription is to ask the captured state itself to administer the cure, which, of course, just reactivates the exact mechanism of capture she's trying to defeat. Section 3. The engagement asymmetry. But human psychology and academic blind spots alone don't explain the sheer ferocity of our political persistence while things objectively deteriorate around us. For that, we've got to look at the platform layer, the social media architecture delivering information to billions of us. Using data from Nobel laureate Maria Ressa, we see this purely mechanical reality. Algorithms don't have morals, they just optimize for engagement. Structural analysis is methodical. It requires patience, and frankly, it bores the algorithm to tears. Tribal spectacle, on the other hand, that triggers our nervous system's response to threat. anger and fear. The platforms mechanically suppress the structural diagnosis while heavily rewarding the emotional outrage, completely sorting what billions of people see every single day. And the engagement asymmetry between trivial spectacle and actual technical analysis isn't just, say, 10 to 1. It is a staggering 1,000 to 1. Think about the scale of that. Across an audience of billions, this ratio mathematically ensures that any structural questions are utterly drowned out in a vast ocean of partisan noise. By the time someone even stumbles upon a structural question, they have already been conditioned by 1,000 pieces of content designed to keep them locked inside their ideological framework. Section 4. The closed loop. So, let's see how all of this builds into an inescapable architecture. This sequence is really the core of our explainer today. Step 1. The monetary mechanism creates widespread economic insecurity. Step 2. The platforms, which remember are themselves products of this corporate monetary architecture, mechanically convert that insecurity into highly engaging tribal outrage. Step 3. This amplified outrage completely blocks the population from diagnosing the structural root of the problem. Which leads to Step 4. Because the root cause remains completely untouched, the mechanism just continues. The system mathematically generates the exact economic fear required to fuel the tribal distractions that keep the system hidden. It is a closed loop. We can actually see this lock in action with the Brookfield case. An investigative presenter found that the massive asset manager Brookfield profits heavily across every ideological boundary. I mean, they hold fossil fuels while simultaneously branding as transition leaders, and they partner with figures on both the far right and the far left. Basically, they win no matter who is in office. But when the presenter went to publish this structural truth, the platform algorithm forced him to frame it as a partisan voting issue, urging viewers to just vote out the current politicians. Why? Because the structural truth doesn't trigger engagement. The very mechanism he documented prevented him from acting on it. Section 5. The structural precondition. This closed loop has generated a profound and, frankly, entirely rational despair among voters. People have done exactly what their political traditions instructed them to do, only to watch their own situations consistently worsen. The human cost here isn't abstract. It's a 50-year track record of failed prescriptions. We've seen stagnant wages despite decades of left-wing victories because the spending ran right through a system that converted it into asset inflation. We've seen massive corporate concentration despite right-wing deregulation because cheap credit feeds consolidation. And we've seen rising consumption despite decades of green diplomacy. Every electoral victory, regardless of the political camp, simply funneled energy straight back into the exact same extractive monetary architecture. Which brings us to the crucial concept of the structural precondition. Reforming the monetary system, actually addressing fractional reserve banking and the corporate capture of the state, isn't some magical silver bullet that's going to solve all human conflict, but it is the absolute mathematical prerequisite for any political camp's goals to ever become possible. Whether you want social democracy, free markets, or effective climate action, you simply cannot build it on a substrate designed to intercept and consume those efforts. Until the architecture changes, the monetary mechanism will just keep intercepting our solutions. The left spending will keep inflating assets. The right's deregulation will keep consolidating monopolies. And our social media platforms will keep ensuring we fight each other over the symptoms instead of diagnosing the system itself. Ideology operating inside this unexamined machine literally makes everything worse. Which leaves us with one massive lingering question to wrap up on. If every branded political framework is really just a different flavor of fuel for the fire, and if our platforms are structurally designed to suppress the truth, how do we fundamentally change the architecture without getting pulled right back into the illusion? What method actually survives this loop? Think about that as you scroll through your feed today. Thank you for joining me on this explainer and keep questioning the substrate.